The cruelest moments in life are often the ones that teach us who truly deserves a crown. Grace Carter stood beneath the towering silver arches of the Moon Hall with both hands folded quietly before her, her simple ivory gown glowing softly beneath hundreds of crystal lanterns suspended high above the marble floor. Around her, representatives from every allied pack filled the magnificent ceremonial chamber, their elegant winter cloaks embroidered with ancient wolf crests that shimmered beneath the warm candlelight. The air carried the faint fragrance of white lilies and evergreen branches decorating every stone column, while a choir quietly sang the traditional hymn reserved only for the choosing of a Luna. It should have been the happiest day of her life. Instead, Grace felt strangely peaceful, perhaps because she had already accepted an ending that everyone else seemed too polite to say aloud. She knew why she had been invited. Every major pack had presented an unmarried Omega of honorable character, and tradition required the Alpha King to meet them all before announcing his future queen. Grace had never believed her name truly belonged among theirs. The daughters of powerful families stood only a few steps away wearing dazzling gowns adorned with rare jewels, their confident smiles reflecting years of preparation for this very ceremony. Grace possessed none of those advantages. She came from a quiet mountain village where her days were spent tending herb gardens, helping elderly neighbors repair fences after winter storms, and reading worn library books beside the fireplace long after sunset. Her greatest accomplishment had never been winning admiration. It had been making certain no one around her felt forgotten. She gently touched the small silver pendant hidden beneath her dress. It had belonged to her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her parents passed away. The old woman had often smiled whenever Grace doubted herself. "Never measure your worth by whether someone chooses you," she used to say. "Measure it by the kindness you leave behind when they do not." Those words had stayed with Grace through every lonely season of her life. Across the grand hall, enormous doors slowly opened. Every conversation immediately faded into silence. The Alpha King entered accompanied only by two royal guards who respectfully remained several steps behind him. Tall, composed, and dressed in a dark ceremonial cloak trimmed with white winter fur, he carried himself with the effortless confidence of someone born to lead yet never burdened by the need to prove it. His snow-white hair caught the golden light, while his striking eyes calmly surveyed the gathered assembly. Grace lowered her gaze as tradition required, yet something compelled her to look up once more. For the briefest moment, their eyes met across the vast chamber. His expression revealed nothing she could understand. There was neither recognition nor rejection, neither warmth nor distance. Only quiet thoughtfulness before his attention returned to the ceremony awaiting him. Grace smiled faintly to herself. That was enough. She had not come seeking miracles. She had come to honor the invitation, to respect the ancient customs, and to keep the promise she had once whispered beside her grandmother's bedside. If she was not chosen today, she would leave with the same dignity she had carried into the hall. Beyond the towering windows, soft snow began falling across the palace gardens as the master of ceremonies stepped forward, holding the ancient silver crown that would soon rest upon the head of the kingdom's future Luna. Every heartbeat inside the Moon Hall seemed to pause together. Grace quietly released a slow breath, believing that within the next few minutes her story inside the palace would come to a gentle and unforgettable end. The master of ceremonies slowly lifted the ancient silver crown, and every eye inside the Moon Hall followed its graceful rise through the warm glow of countless crystal lanterns. The choir's final note faded into complete silence as the Alpha King stepped forward across the polished marble floor. His footsteps echoed gently beneath the vaulted ceiling while the gathered nobles held their breath, each convinced they already knew how the ceremony would end. Grace remained where she stood, her hands resting quietly. Before her, the small silver pendant beneath her gown feeling warmer against her heart with every passing second. She had rehearsed this moment many times during the long journey to the palace. She had imagined disappointment. She had imagined relief. She had even imagined returning home before the evening snow had finished falling. Yet now that the moment had finally arrived, she felt only an unexpected calm. The Alpha King walked past the first candidate with a respectful nod. He paused briefly before another, offering the same quiet courtesy. One by one, he continued down the elegant line of hopeful Omegas while the spectators watched every movement with eager anticipation. When he reached Grace, time itself seemed to slow. She lifted her eyes just enough to meet his gaze for a single heartbeat. His golden eyes rested upon her with thoughtful stillness, as though weighing something invisible to everyone else in the hall. For the briefest instant, Grace wondered whether destiny had changed its mind. Then, without speaking, the Alpha King continued walking. He passed her by. Grace lowered her eyes again before anyone could notice the tiny flicker of disappointment that crossed her face. It lasted only a moment before she quietly smiled to herself. This was exactly what she had expected. A few steps farther, the Alpha King stopped before a graceful young noblewoman from one of the kingdom's oldest families. She stood tall in a magnificent gown embroidered with silver thread, her confidence shining as brightly as the jewels woven into her hair. The master of ceremonies stepped forward, and with careful dignity, the Alpha King accepted the ancient crown before gently placing it upon the young woman's head. Applause immediately filled the moon hall. Noble families smiled with satisfaction, while respectful cheers echoed beneath the towering arches. Grace joined the applause without hesitation. She clapped softly, sincerely, refusing to allow bitterness to steal joy from someone else's happiness. A lady standing nearby glanced toward her with visible sympathy before quietly looking away. Grace noticed the expression but chose not to acknowledge it. Pity had never comforted anyone. As the celebration continued around her, she reached slowly toward the delicate silver hairpin securing her long chestnut hair. It had been given to every candidate before the ceremony as a symbol of hope. With gentle hands, she removed it and held it quietly in her palm. There was no anger in the gesture, only acceptance. She carefully placed the ornament upon a nearby velvet cushion prepared for those leaving the ceremony without the crown. Then she smoothed the folds of her simple ivory gown and turned toward the enormous carved doors leading back into the snowy afternoon. No tears blurred her vision. No hurried footsteps betrayed her emotions. She intended to leave with exactly what her grandmother had always taught her to protect above all else: her dignity. She had almost reached the center aisle when the master of ceremonies called for the hall to prepare for the final blessing. Grace paused for only a moment before continuing toward the exit, believing that no one would notice one quiet omega disappearing into the falling snow. She did not know that more than one pair of eyes was still following her every step. Grace had almost reached the towering doors of the moon hall when the solemn voice of the master of ceremonies echoed gently through the chamber once more. "Before the blessing concludes," he announced, "according to ancient custom, any candidate who wishes to offer a final word to the moon goddess may do so." Several nobles exchanged quiet glances. Few ever accepted the invitation. Most chose to leave in silence rather than expose their disappointment before an entire kingdom. Grace paused with one hand resting lightly upon the bronze door handle. For a brief moment, she considered continuing into the softly falling snow outside. Then her fingers slowly slipped away from the handle. She turned back toward the center of the hall, her expression calm, her shoulders relaxed, carrying neither resentment nor regret. The applause had already faded. The newly crowned bride stood proudly beneath the crystal chandeliers while the Alpha King remained beside her, his composed expression impossible to read. Hundreds of eyes quietly followed Grace as she walked back toward the ceremonial platform. The enormous chamber felt even larger now that every whispered conversation had disappeared. She stopped several respectful steps away from the throne dais before offering a graceful bow to the Alpha King, the council, and finally to the young woman wearing the silver crown. "Your Majesty," Grace said softly, her voice steady despite the silence surrounding her. "Thank you for allowing someone from a small village to stand inside this hall today." No one interrupted. "I came here knowing I might return home exactly as I arrived. I never expected a crown. I only hoped to honor the invitation with respect." She lifted her eyes toward the newly chosen bride, her gentle smile completely sincere. "I wish you every happiness. I hope the people of this kingdom always find comfort in your kindness, especially on the days when the crown feels heavier than anyone can imagine." A quiet murmur moved through the gathered guests. Grace continued before emotion could catch her voice. "Please remember the children who wait through long winters for warm meals. Remember the elderly who pretend they do not need help because they fear becoming a burden. Remember the families living in distant villages who may never stand inside these beautiful halls. If they feel cared for, then every heart here today will have chosen wisely. She lowered her gaze once more. That is all I wish to say. The chamber remained completely still. No dramatic speech. No accusation. No plea to change destiny. Only quiet hope offered for people who would never know her name. Grace bowed one final time before turning toward the great doors again. This time she truly believed the ceremony had ended for her. She took one slow step across the polished marble floor. Then another. The soft rustle of her gown became the only sound beneath the towering ceiling. Even the musicians forgot to lift their instruments. Behind her, the Alpha King remained motionless. His hand rested lightly against the arm of the ceremonial throne, yet his attention no longer lingered upon the silver crown or the celebration prepared around him. It followed only the quiet young Omega walking away without bitterness, carrying nothing except the same kindness she had brought into the hall. Grace reached the final step before the doors, believing she was only moments away from disappearing into the peaceful snowfall beyond the palace. She never heard the Alpha King move, but every person inside the Moon Hall suddenly did. Grace stopped just before the enormous bronze doors as an unexpected sound echoed across the silent hall. It was not the music. It was not another announcement from the Master of Ceremonies. It was the unmistakable sound of measured footsteps crossing polished marble with calm purpose. She slowly turned around. Every noble, every elder, every guest had already shifted their attention toward the center aisle. The Alpha King was no longer standing beside the ceremonial throne. Instead, he was walking away from it, away from the silver crown that had just been placed upon another bride. His expression remained calm, but there was a quiet certainty in every step that immediately silenced the last remaining whispers. Grace instinctively stepped aside, believing he intended to leave the hall by the same entrance. Instead, he stopped only a few feet in front of her. Neither of them spoke at first. Snow drifted gently beyond the open windows, while warm lantern light reflected across the marble floor between them. Grace looked at him with respectful confusion. "Your Majesty?" she asked softly. The Alpha King held her gaze for a long moment before speaking. "May I ask you a question?" Grace nodded. "Of course." His voice remained steady enough for the entire hall to hear. "When you believed you had lost everything you came here for, why did you choose to speak about the people instead of yourself?" The question surprised everyone present. Grace lowered her eyes thoughtfully before answering. "Because disappointment belongs to one person," she replied gently. "A kingdom belongs to everyone." The silence deepened. She continued quietly. "If I had left only with sadness, nothing would have changed. But if the future Luna remembers those who are often forgotten, perhaps today will still become a blessing for someone else." Several elders exchanged thoughtful glances. Even the royal advisors who had remained perfectly composed throughout the ceremony now watched with visible curiosity. The Alpha King looked toward the gathered assembly before returning his attention to Grace. "Do you know why this ceremony exists?" She shook her head. "I believed it was to choose the next Luna." A faint smile appeared on his face, small enough that only those standing closest could truly notice it. "That is what most people believe." He slowly turned toward the council members seated beneath the ancient wolf banners. "Many years ago, my father told me that beauty fades, influence changes, and powerful alliances rise and fall. But a kingdom survives only when its queen continues to see those no one else notices." His words settled gently across the chamber. Grace listened without moving. The Alpha King continued. "For generations, this ceremony has never been a contest to discover the most admired candidate. It has always been the final lesson. Every candidate is given one last opportunity after believing the decision has already been made. In that single moment, titles disappear and only character remains." A quiet murmur spread through the hall as realization slowly reached those gathered there. The newly crowned noblewoman lowered her head with graceful understanding, showing neither anger nor resentment. She seemed to understand the tradition better than anyone expected. The Alpha King stepped toward the ceremonial platform and carefully lifted the ancient silver crown into his hands once more. No one moved. No one questioned him. Grace remained where she stood, her heart beating faster with every passing second, unable to understand why destiny suddenly felt unfinished. As the Alpha King turned back toward her carrying the crown through the quiet moon hall, every person present realized the ceremony they believed had already ended had only now reached the moment it had truly been waiting for. The Alpha King carried the ancient silver crown with both hands as he walked slowly across the moon hall, and every person present instinctively stepped aside, creating a quiet path between him and Grace. No one dared interrupt. Even the musicians remained perfectly still, their unfinished melody hanging silently beneath the towering crystal chandeliers. Grace could hardly believe what she was seeing. Only moments earlier she had accepted that her place inside the palace had come to an end. Now the ruler of the kingdom stood before her once again, holding the symbol every candidate had dreamed about. She looked at him with gentle uncertainty. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "I do not understand." His calm expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That is because this ceremony has never been what most people believed it to be." He turned slowly toward the assembled nobles, village elders, and council members whose eyes remained fixed upon him. Many generations ago, the first Alpha King who established this kingdom left behind a simple instruction for every ruler who would follow him. The master of ceremonies respectfully lowered his head as though hearing familiar words spoken once more. The Alpha King continued. He wrote that a queen chosen because she desired a crown would eventually serve the crown before the people. But a queen willing to leave without bitterness would always remember the people before herself. A thoughtful silence settled over the hall. Grace listened carefully, her heart beating faster with every sentence. Today, the Alpha King said, every candidate believed the decision had already been made. Only one person spoke without hoping to gain anything in return. His golden eyes met Grace's once again. Only one person used her final words to protect strangers instead of herself. Grace lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by emotions she had not expected to feel. "I only said what I believed," she answered quietly. "Exactly." His reply came without hesitation. Character is revealed most clearly when kindness no longer offers a reward. Several respected elders nodded with quiet approval. One elderly council member slowly rose from his seat before placing his hand over his heart in silent respect toward Grace. Others soon followed, not because they had been instructed to do so, but because they recognized the truth unfolding before them. The young noblewoman who had first received the silver crown stepped forward gracefully. With a warm and sincere smile, she carefully removed the crown from her own head and bowed respectfully toward Grace. "I understand now," she said gently. "A queen worthy of this kingdom was never meant to be the woman standing closest to the throne. She was the woman whose heart never left the villages beyond these walls." Grace's eyes widened in surprise. She quickly shook her head. "Please, I never wished to take anything away from you." The young noblewoman smiled kindly. "You have not taken anything. You reminded all of us why this tradition still exists." The Alpha King looked around the hall one final time before lifting the silver crown slightly higher. "Power may choose rulers," he said calmly, "but compassion chooses those worthy of being remembered." Warm afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, covering Grace in gentle colors as the snow continued falling peacefully beyond the palace. The entire moon hall watched in complete silence while the Alpha King took one final step closer, raising the ancient crown with steady hands. Grace stood motionless, her heart filled not with pride, but with humble disbelief, realizing that the moment she believed her story had ended had quietly become the beginning of something far greater than she had ever dared to imagine. The ancient silver crown rested in the Alpha King's steady hands as the entire moon hall seemed to forget how to breathe. Grace stood quietly before him, unable to move, unable to fully understand how the ceremony that had begun with quiet acceptance had transformed into this impossible moment. Snow drifted gently beyond the towering windows while warm afternoon light spilled through the stained glass, surrounding the polished marble floor with soft shades of gold and blue. The Alpha King looked at Grace with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the ceremony, yet now there was unmistakable warmth behind his golden eyes. "Grace Carter," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast chamber, "when you believed you had already lost the future you hoped for, you chose compassion instead of resentment. You reminded every person in this hall that leadership begins long before a crown is ever worn." Grace lowered her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your Majesty, I simply spoke from my heart." He nodded gently. That is exactly why those words mattered. He slowly lifted the silver crown, but before placing it upon her head, he turned once more toward the gathered nobles and representatives from every allied pack. "Let every witness remember this day," he declared calmly. "A kingdom will always be strongest when kindness is honored before ambition, and when humility is valued above appearance." No one challenged his words. One by one, respected elders placed their hands over their hearts. Members of the royal council followed. Even those who had quietly expected Grace to disappear from the palace only moments earlier now looked upon her with genuine respect. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and bowed deeply before the Alpha King. "Your Majesty," he said with quiet reverence, "the ancient tradition has been fulfilled exactly as our ancestors intended." The Alpha King smiled faintly before turning back toward Grace. "May I?" he asked softly, seeking her permission before completing the ceremony. Grace looked up with tears shining gently in her blue eyes, not from sorrow, but from overwhelming gratitude. She answered with a small, sincere nod. With careful hands, the Alpha King placed the ancient silver crown upon her head. It settled lightly, almost as though it had always belonged there. The choir, silent until that very moment, began singing once again, their voices filling the moon hall with a melody that seemed warmer and brighter than before. Sunlight broke through the winter clouds outside, illuminating the falling snow until every flake sparkled like tiny stars drifting toward the earth. Grace instinctively reached up to touch the crown before quickly lowering her hand again, still unable to believe it was real. The Alpha King noticed her uncertainty and offered a reassuring smile. "You do not have to become someone different today," he said quietly. "The woman who cared for forgotten villages, who celebrated another person's happiness while believing her own dream had ended, is exactly the queen this kingdom has been waiting for." Grace felt the weight in her heart finally lift. She looked across the great hall and saw not strangers judging her, but people smiling with quiet encouragement. The young noblewoman who had first worn the crown applauded first, followed by the elders, then the council, until the entire moon hall echoed with warm applause that carried none of the excitement of victory and all of the sincerity of shared understanding. As the Alpha King offered his arm, Grace accepted it with humble gratitude, and together they turned toward the great windows where the peaceful snowfall continued across the kingdom. Beyond the palace walls, countless villages carried on with ordinary life, unaware that their future queen had been chosen not because she sought greatness, but because even in disappointment she had remembered them first, and from that quiet act of selfless kindness, a new chapter for the entire kingdom had gently begun. The celebration continued long after the choir's final note faded into the winter afternoon, yet the Alpha King quietly excused himself from the formal reception before the first banquet was announced. Grace noticed only because she had begun to recognize the gentle rhythm of his decisions. Whenever attention gathered too closely around him, he naturally stepped toward quieter places instead. Curious, she wandered through the palace corridors until she discovered him standing alone inside the ancient observatory overlooking the snow-covered valley. Towering windows framed the endless forest stretching beyond the castle walls, while the setting sun painted the mountains in soft shades of gold and pale blue. He was not studying royal documents or speaking with advisors. Instead, he stood silently watching smoke rise from distant village chimneys. Grace approached carefully before stopping several respectful steps behind him. "Your Majesty?" she asked softly. He turned and smiled with quiet warmth. "You may call me Adrian when we are alone." The suggestion surprised her. "I am not certain I deserve that." Yet, his smile deepened almost imperceptibly. Respect is not measured by titles. She looked toward the peaceful villages below. "I still feel as though today happened to someone else." He nodded with understanding. "I expected you might." They remained side by side in comfortable silence until Grace finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had lingered inside her heart ever since the ceremony. "When did you first notice me?" Adrian rested his hands lightly upon the stone balcony. "Nearly 2 years ago." Grace turned toward him with visible surprise. He continued calmly. "One of my advisors returned from your village after inspecting winter roads. His report mentioned a young Omega who postponed her own harvest because an elderly couple nearby could not finish theirs before the first snowfall. Grace blinked. That was nothing extraordinary. Perhaps not to you. He looked toward the valley once more. Several months later, another report described someone organizing books for children after the village library roof was repaired. Then another spoke of the woman who carried baskets of herbs through snowstorms because the healer had become ill. Grace lowered her eyes. Those had been ordinary days that she had never imagined anyone beyond her village would remember. Adrian continued in the same calm voice. Every report described different events, yet one detail never changed. No one praised your kindness because you asked to be noticed. They mentioned it because you believed no one was watching. Grace felt emotion gently tighten within her chest. I thought those moments disappeared the day they ended. He slowly shook his head. Kindness never disappears. It simply travels farther than the person who offers it. Evening light gradually filled the observatory with a peaceful golden glow. Grace smiled quietly, remembering every time she had doubted whether simple acts could ever matter in a world that admired strength and influence. Adrian looked at her with steady sincerity. The ceremony was never meant to discover perfection. I have never believed perfect people exist. I searched only for someone whose first instinct would always be compassion. Grace laughed softly through grateful tears. Then I suppose my grandmother understood your ancestors better than either of us realized. Adrian tilted his head with gentle curiosity. She always told me that if I walked away from every disappointment with my heart still open, one day the right door would open because of it. Adrian's expression grew thoughtful before he answered quietly. Today an entire kingdom watched that lesson become true. As the first evening stars appeared above the snow-covered mountains, Grace realized she no longer felt overwhelmed by the crown resting lightly upon her head. For the first time, it no longer felt like a reward. It felt like a promise to protect every quiet voice that might otherwise be forgotten, just as someone had once chosen not to overlook hers. The following morning, the palace gates opened before sunrise, welcoming representatives from villages across the kingdom for the annual Winter Council, a tradition where ordinary citizens could speak directly with the royal family. Grace stood beside Adrian at the entrance of the great hall, the ancient silver crown resting lightly upon her head. Yet she greeted every visitor with the same gentle smile she had once offered neighbors back in her small mountain village. Farmers carrying weathered hats, teachers with worn leather journals, craftsmen, healers, and elderly couples slowly entered beneath the towering stone arches. None of them looked at Grace with fear. Instead, they smiled with quiet relief, as though seeing someone who understood the ordinary lives they had traveled so far to represent. Adrian noticed every expression. He had attended this gathering many times before, but never had the atmosphere felt so warm. As the council began, each visitor stepped forward to share hopes for the coming winter. Some requested stronger bridges before the spring rains arrived. Others asked for additional medicine to reach distant settlements before heavy snow closed the mountain roads. Grace listened without interruption, taking careful notes with elegant handwriting upon parchment resting beside her chair. When an elderly shepherd apologized for speaking too long, Grace smiled gently and thanked him for making the long journey despite his age. The old man blinked with visible surprise before smiling back. No queen has ever thanked me simply for coming, he admitted quietly. Grace answered without hesitation. Your journey matters because your village matters. Soft murmurs of approval spread through the hall. Adrian watched her from beside the royal table, saying very little. He realized she was doing exactly what she had promised during the ceremony. She remembered the people who were usually forgotten. Hours later, after the final village representative had finished speaking, the master of ceremonies approached with the official record book that traditionally summarized each year's meeting. For generations, every queen had written a formal closing statement filled with promises of prosperity and strength. The great leather volume was placed before Grace together with a silver pen. She paused only briefly before writing a single sentence across the fresh page. When she finished, Adrian quietly read the words before looking at her with unmistakable admiration. The master of ceremonies respectfully asked whether the statement should be read aloud. Adrian nodded. The elderly official smiled warmly before speaking to the entire hall. The strength of a kingdom is measured by how well the quietest voices are heard. Complete silence followed. Then one by one, the village representatives rose to their feet. No one had instructed them to stand. They simply did so together, placing their hands over their hearts in sincere gratitude. Grace felt emotion gently rise within her chest as she looked across the familiar faces. These were the very people she had spoken about when she believed she was leaving the palace forever. Adrian slowly stood beside her before addressing the gathering. Yesterday, this kingdom witnessed the choosing of a queen. Today, it has witnessed the reason she was chosen. Warm winter sunlight poured through the towering windows, filling the great hall with golden light, while snowflakes drifted peacefully beyond the glass. Grace looked around the chamber and realized the crown no longer represented honor alone. It represented responsibility shared with every person standing before her. In that quiet morning, surrounded by ordinary people whose stories mattered just as much as any noble title, she understood that destiny had never changed because she was finally seen. Destiny had changed because she had never stopped seeing everyone else. Several weeks passed, and winter slowly gave way to the first gentle signs of spring. Snow still rested upon the highest mountain peaks, but streams once hidden beneath thick ice began flowing freely again, carrying fresh water through every valley of the kingdom. Grace stood beside the familiar window of the Moon Hall just after sunrise, watching golden lights spread across the villages below. The ancient silver crown rested quietly upon a nearby table rather than upon her head. She had learned that the greatest responsibilities were never carried by symbols alone. They were carried by everyday choices. Behind her, the great ceremonial hall looked remarkably different from the day she had first entered believing she would leave unnoticed. The same marble floor reflected the morning sunlight. The same crystal lanterns hung beneath the towering ceiling. The same ancient banners stirred gently in the spring breeze, drifting through open windows. Yet everything felt transformed because her heart had changed. Adrian entered the hall carrying 2 warm cups of herbal tea, smiling as he noticed where she stood. "You always find this window before anyone else does," he said softly. Grace accepted the cup with a grateful smile. "It reminds me where this journey truly began." Together they looked across the peaceful kingdom. Farmers were already working green fields where snow had disappeared. Children crossed wooden bridges carrying baskets filled with fresh flowers. Smoke curled gently from cottage chimneys as another ordinary day quietly began. Adrian spoke after a thoughtful silence. "Do you remember what you said before you tried to leave the ceremony?" Grace nodded. "I asked the future queen to remember the people." He smiled gently. "You became exactly the person you hoped someone else would be." His words settled warmly inside her heart. Grace looked down toward the village roads winding through the valley. She recognized several places she had once walked as an ordinary Omega carrying baskets of herbs for neighbors who could no longer climb the hills themselves. Nothing about those memories embarrassed her now. They reminded her that the person standing beside a king should never forget the path that first taught her compassion. A soft knock echoed through the hall before the master of ceremonies entered carrying the same ancient record book opened during the Winter Council. He respectfully placed it upon the ceremonial table. "Your Majesty," he said with a warm smile directed toward Grace, "the council has unanimously approved your first royal initiative." Grace looked at him with quiet curiosity. The elderly official opened the heavy pages until she found her own handwritten sentence recorded forever in the kingdom's history. Beneath it appeared a new royal decree signed by Adrian. Every remote village would receive additional teachers, traveling healers, and winter supplies before the next cold season arrived. Grace felt her eyes fill gently with grateful tears. The promise she had spoken when she believed she had nothing left to gain had already begun changing countless lives she would never personally meet. Adrian stepped beside her and quietly closed the great book. "One sentence changed an entire ceremony," he said. "Now it will help change an entire kingdom." Grace slipped her hand into his, not because a tradition required it, but because trust had quietly grown between them through honesty, patience, and shared purpose. Beyond the palace windows, the morning bells began ringing across the capital while sunlight covered the valley with new warmth. Grace smiled peacefully, finally understanding that the happiest endings rarely begin when someone is chosen. They begin when someone refuses to stop choosing kindness, even after believing the story is already over. And long after the applause inside the Moon Hall had faded into memory, the people remembered not the day a crown changed hands, but the quiet words of one humble Omega that reminded an Alpha King, an entire kingdom, and generations yet to come that true greatness is never measured by who is crowned first, but by whose heart continues to care when no reward remains.